it is a real challenge to introduce Judy. She is someone that is so accomplished and just a downright wonderful person. I don't know how to even start with the introduction. Judy and her colleagues have helped the country and the world come to understand disability rights as human rights. She was an early leader in the right to education, the right to teach, and the right to live independently. Judy helped drive passage of landmark legislation and policies in the US, including the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. The story of the disability movement and Judy's role in it was really beautifully portrayed in the award-winning documentary Crip Camp. I hope all of you got a chance to see that before this event today. And also in her recently released memoir, Being Human. Judy was Assistant Secretary of Education during the Clinton administration. She was the World Bank's first advisor on disability and development. And she was President Obama's Special Advisor on Disability Rights to the State Department. She's a senior fellow with the Ford Foundation. Her influence on policy is felt globally, but perhaps more importantly, it's felt at the individual level. Her extraordinary life teaches us what it means to be human, to imagine a world that is fairer, more equitable, and more just. Judy, there's so much we want to discuss with you. So we want to get right into it. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts with the Stanford community.
So I want to start off by first thanking Chris, who's always very humble. And I started working at the World Bank in 2002 and got to meet Chris pretty early on. At that time, the president of the World Bank was Jim Wolfenson, and he had an interest in disability because he had a good friend who was a cellist who had acquired a disability. And so he was involved with a number of organizations that were dealing around issues of discrimination and disability, although the groups weren't necessarily doing discrimination, but he was learning about it. And so he was very supportive as we were looking at what were some of the causes for the World Bank not really integrating disability into its agenda, and more importantly, not really understanding why it mattered. And so I met Chris early on, and he was, from the very beginning, for those of you who are working with him now, a completely amazing guy, not just because of his intellect, but because he's got this real willingness and desire to listen and to be proactive. And so as we were working on developing capacity in different components of the bank, he was one of the people that began to work with us on a working group. And it was really through that experience that I got to know him better. The fact that he's been focusing on education from the World Bank and working on the inclusion of disability in his work, I think allows him to really understand the complexity, the multifaceted issues that we're dealing with. Because on the one hand, when we talk about education, you know, we're thinking about kids going to school, teachers being trained, on and on, all of which is critical, but really needing to also get a much better understanding about why this is not happening, not just for children with disabilities, but for other marginalized populations. So when Chris asks me to do anything, I always say yes, because I value him so much. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Oh, thank you, Judy. It's really an honor to have you here. I can't tell you how pleased, how
And I
thrilled we
have
are.
to say that I feel that I can take credit, I hope, for one thing. So Chris lives in my neighborhood, or I live in Chris's neighborhood, because he's lived here longer than I have. And one day I saw him riding a bicycle without a helmet.
Oh, no.
And I almost went apoplectic. And then found out that his husband also was apoplectic over it. Now I do think you are using a helmet, right?
I am, yes.
So if there's one thing I can feel good about is he's wearing a helmet.
Thank you, Judy.
which just speaks to how much you care about other people, Judy.
Actually.
Judy, we're just intrigued by the film and your book, and how your personal and your professional lives are intertwined. Do you want to start by reading a little passage from your book, Being Human?
The book is a memoir, and so obviously it's really focusing on my life. The camp is a part of the book because it was a part of my life. But what I'm going to read about now is when I was younger, and it's towards the beginning of the book. And so it'll give you a little bit of an understanding of some of the issues, not just for me, because lots of my friends and others who've been reading the book talk about how they're reading this book makes them feel like they're reading their story. I think it was a beautiful sunny day, but it might have been cloudy. I don't remember. What I do remember was being caught up in my conversation with Arlene as she pushed me in my wheelchair, talking about what we were going to buy at the candy store or what we wanted to do later that day. We were pleased to be walking around the corner to buy sweets in front of Dr. Nagler's brick house, which I knew was Dr. Nagler's house because I'd been there with my mother for her doctor's appointments. We paused across the street. I was about 8 years old then. Arlene turned me around to lower my wheelchair off the curb, pushed me across the street, and then once we reached the other side, she put her foot on the metal bar on the back of my chair, tipped me and the chair back, and lifted my chair onto the sidewalk. As we did this, a few kids came toward us from the opposite direction. They were walking slowly down the sidewalk. As they passed, Arlene shifted my wheelchair to the side to make room for them. We didn't know them and didn't pay much attention, engrossed as we were in our conversation. So I was surprised when one of the kids turned suddenly to look at me. He stood in front of me, staring down at me in my wheelchair. "Are you sick?" he asked me loudly. I stared at him, not understanding. "What? Are you sick?" he repeated insistently. His voice boomed. I shook my head, trying to clear the words away. I was still confused, but couldn't speak. "Are you sick?" he asked, slowing the words down as if I were a toddler. The world went silent as the words reverberated in my head. I couldn't hear anything except those words. "Are you sick? Sick, 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 sick." I shrank down, frozen with confusion, wanting to cover myself up with something, anything to hide from that question, the boy's insistent eyes on me. "Are you sick?" he asked insistently, almost shouting. Suddenly I became aware of Dr. Nagler's house behind us, and my face turned a cringingly deep red. Does he think I'm going to the doctor? But he's not my doctor, I thought fiercely. I fought back tears. I wouldn't cry in front of everyone. I wasn't sick. It made no sense. I knew I wasn't. But then, why was he asking me that? I became uncertain of myself. Was I sick? I saw myself through his eyes, and the light around me shifted. Shadows emerged from the corners of my mind, previously submerged words, thoughts, and half-heard conversations tumbled into the glare of a spotlight. In a blinding flash, everything in my life made a perverse kind of sense. I couldn't go to this school. I couldn't go to that school. I couldn't do this. I couldn't do that. I couldn't walk up the stairs. I couldn't open doors. I couldn't even cross the street. I was different. But I'd always known that. It wasn't that. It was the world and how it saw me. The world thought I was sick. Sick people stayed home in bed. They didn't go out to play or go to school. They weren't expected to go outside, to be a part of things, to be a part of the world. I wasn't expected to be a part of the world. Abruptly, I knew this to be true. As if the knowledge had already existed for years, throughout my entire body. I felt nauseatingly humiliated at the idea that everyone else had known this but me. Had they kept it from me, the embarrassment settled in as a cold ball deep in my stomach, where I could feel it spreading into my limbs. Was it sunny or cloudy? I don't know. I remember Arlene was pushing me. We were going to the store to buy candy, and we were chatting. And I was a butterfly, becoming a caterpillar.
Wow.
Wow.
Judy, that line just really speaks so much to this transformation of falling into what other people see you as. And the question I have around this is just thinking about this confusion or conflating between disability and illness. And do you have a sense of where the root of that comes from and kind of the ill effects that come from this misperception?
I think it's pretty historic. You know, we've seen way before our lives that the big push has been on cure. And I don't speak against things like using glasses or hearing aids or crutches, braces, wheelchairs. Those are a part of what we need to be able to live our lives. I think people look at us, I think it's somewhat changing over the years, but still really as objects of pity. And because we have not been meaningfully integrated into our communities in radio and television and movies and magazines and books and on, people really don't know much about us except what they may or may not see in their communities. And again, you know, for me, because I'm 72, when I think about what people saw and still see, disabled people in segregated classrooms, disabled people not being employed to the same degree as others, the whole issue of shame and fear around being identified as having a disability if one has an invisible disability. The approach to looking at disability as part of the rights-based movement, justice movement, is really something only in the last 50, 60 years. And so I think we have a lot of unlearning to do. We've talked, you know, for a long time about the medical model versus the social model, now the justice model. And the medical model certainly is one that still exists very significantly. Instead of looking at how we can move forward with our lives with whatever disability there is, and medical research and things going on, but our lives not having to stop because people are doing research in different areas. I think that's a fundamental issue. Sorry.
Judy, you said a few paragraphs later in the book that everything changed when you went to school. But I know your schooling experience was also difficult.
Yeah.
Can you tell us, how did you go then from being a caterpillar to a butterfly again? When did you start thinking of yourself as a leader?
You know, so I never, people ask me that question all the time. And it's, I mean, I see myself as one who likes to speak and speak up. And so I think in many ways, you know, there are some people that have really admired the fact that I will say things that other people may want to say but don't say. And so I've been put in positions where I'm saying things that others may want to say. They play a different role. I think, you know, as I was growing up, for those of you who didn't read the book, I didn't go to school until I was 9 years old. I had home instruction in Brooklyn. So that meant that a teacher came to my house for a total of 2.5 hours a week, one day for an hour, one day for an hour and a half. And as I say, you know, for good performance, they threw in an occupational therapist who came like once a week to teach me needlepoint. Um, but obviously in 2.5 hours a week, there wasn't a vision from the educational system that me and the thousands of other disabled kids who are in home instruction were really going to benefit from education. You know, in New York, it's always been an issue where they've been measuring progress of kids. We have something called the Regent exams, which have been around since the 20s or 30s. But the system that I entered, if you were a wheelchair user, you went to these special education classes. And when I finally started going to school when I was 9, my mother then learned that if the kids used a wheelchair, that we went back onto home instruction, we didn't go to high school. So she and other mothers organized so that we would be able to begin to go to high school, regular high schools. And yeah, I think the lack of expectation is something also that my family, they had expectations. And they were trying to fight the system in their own way. They were immigrants and had lost family in the Holocaust. And my mother was pregnant with my brother when I had polio. She was 8 months pregnant when I had polio. So there was a lot going on, but they really, I mean, very much to their credit, there were no parent organizations really at that time, except for families that had kids with cerebral palsy. So she was making it up as she was going along. And then when I finally started to go to these special ed classes where the teaching was, you know, politely speaking, a joke, it was a time when she also began to meet other parents who had kids with disabilities, and where some of these parents also had expectations for their kids. You know, they wanted them to go to school. My family always talked about how education was important for me because maybe I wouldn't be able to get married, but education was very important. So I had to study. They talked about college and things of that nature. So that was really very important. So for me, I think when I really kind of felt more comfortable in speaking out beyond being with community of disabled people was when I had to make a decision about whether I was going to sue the Board of Education when I was denied my teaching license because I couldn't walk. That was really a difficult moment for me because I had to make a decision of being public about being denied my job and knowing that there would be many people that would think, oh, she's in a wheelchair, she can't be a teacher. And then also worrying about, well, what if I wasn't a good teacher? Would that mean that any other wheelchair riders who wanted to be a teacher would also be denied that experience because I didn't do something well? And I think I began to overcome some of that in the 1970s. The New York Times wrote an article about my being denied my right to teach. And the next day there was an editorial in the New York Times. And then I was asked to be on the Today Show. And so I think all those things that happened so very quickly, like I'd never been on a national television program before. I'd never been on television before. And so being asked to be on the Today Show, that kind of quickly made me realize that I couldn't stumble, I had to just move forward. And I guess that's really in some way where, I don't know that I dubbed myself a leader, but I felt like I could be a spokesperson.
Yeah. So all this work you've done, you've been a huge ally to everybody in the disabled community and really been a spokesperson for us. And something that I like to frame is the difference between an ally and an accomplice. I always like the term accomplice when we're talking about really continuing and finishing something, because I think an ally sort of supports you, but an accomplice goes down with you if something goes down. And it seems like you had a lot of accomplices along the way as you were going through all these different stages of advocacy. And I'm curious how much the support and the really buy-in of able-bodied people and people with non-disabilities has contributed and enabled or even helped bolster the cause and the rights that you've been able to secure for people.
Well, I think it's been very important to be able to both help foster the development of the disability rights community ourselves, and also to identify people who understood and believed that A, discrimination exists, and B, that they wanted to help remedy it in various ways. We wouldn't have had any success with any of the disability rights laws if there weren't non-disabled individuals who really got it. In many cases because they were also involved within the civil rights and human rights communities. And I think, you know, one of the other components of what's gone on, at least in my lifetime, has been that, you know, we've been learning together as we move forward. So, you know, for me, someone like Chris and a few others at the World Bank who were on this working group, who were like points of contact in their areas of specialty. It was a way for me and others who didn't really know the bank to learn about the bank, and for them to learn about disability and to learn how they could be integrating disability into the work that they were doing. Because the handful of us with disabilities who were at the World Bank or at many other places are not going to be able to make these changes by ourselves. And so I think that's been very important. At the same time, I think, you know, I worked in the nonprofit world for about 20 years, and the organizations I worked with were all organizations run by disabled people. And when I started working in the Clinton administration as an assistant secretary, even though I was over the Office of Special Ed and Rehabilitative Services, which focused 100% of our work on disability issues, implementation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Rehabilitation Act, which is on employment, and the National Institute on what was then called the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. It was all disability focused. And when, you know, working outside of that community and trying to get people to understand how disability fits into the work that they're doing in education, like in bilingual education, in early childhood, in vocational education, in higher education, it was really critical to get these different offices to really look at what was or wasn't happening to disabled infants through all ages for higher education. And everybody is busy. They didn't necessarily want to take the time. The information wasn't readily available. That was in part what my office had responsibility for doing, was gathering information, doing research. But I also really wanted them to be including disability in the research that they were doing, because it would become more important to them if they understood how these issues impacted their work, not just our office. So I think we've gotten more colleagues, friends, advocates along the way, but we need many more. And I think people can more effectively feel comfortable in that job if they're learning more. I honestly feel that higher education has really not been doing a great job on educating the general population on campus or in the community or faculty on how disability fits into literature or health sciences or, you know, education or whatever it may be. And that obviously has an adverse impact. You have all these people coming out of higher education where disability is so limitedly discussed. And then, you know, they go into a classroom and you know, I think many of us who work in this area completely understand that if you have a teacher who's well trained to work with kids who have disabilities, with the premise that they'll be doing a lot of their work in inclusive classrooms, that their knowledge is not just beneficial for disabled kids, but for diverse learners who don't all learn the same way. But it's still not yet going the way it needs to.
Absolutely. Judy, what really I loved about Crip Camp was that story of empowerment and building community, and then reaching out to the allies. In the case when you occupied the federal building in San Francisco, the support that you, the coalitions you had built with the Panthers, with the press. It's an amazing story. Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on how you build community, how you build coalitions for change? I loved also the reflection you always said, everyone has to have their voice. Everyone needs to listen. Everyone needs their space to speak. Maybe share a little of your philosophy on leadership and coalition building and choosing when to resist and when to push forward with us.
So I think in a very early part of my life, I started recognizing that the issues that we were facing and the issues that others were facing. I speak about television and the importance of television, because television was coming in to being in the 50s and then obviously expanding over the decades. But it was in the 50s and 60s that we also were learning more vividly about the civil rights movement and the kinds of discrimination and oppression and the adverse effect that it was having on people, but also learning about how people were coming together and organizing. And I think for me, you know, one of the important parts of that experience was looking at how Dr. King and others worked in coalition. So there was a model from when I was young of, you know, people, King and others, speaking about the importance of this being an issue that was not just one of importance in the Black community, but one that society overall needed to be addressing. So I think that was just something that always felt very right to me, because if our objective was and is to be able to be included in society, not to move away from seeing ourselves as disabled individuals, but looking at that more as an asset, being proud of who we are, including our disabilities. Because we came from so many backgrounds, we had to be able to look at going beyond the disability community. We had to be able, if we wanted to be integrated into school or in transportation or in employment or whatever, there were people that were filling all these different functions. And if they didn't see what the problem was and what needed to happen, then we were not likely to make substantial change. At the same time, my friends and myself and many others around the country were learning also about legislation. You know, the big push on the Civil Rights Act of '64, you know, the role of Kennedy, the role of Johnson, the work that had to be done because of the biases and prejudice that members of Congress had. Those are all things that I was always intrigued by. And I think really when I look at the way I've done many things in my life, it's really been mimicking work that was going on at that time. So if you look like from the 50s forward, if you look at the disabled veterans movement, you know, the veterans really started earlier on in issues dealing with accessibility, standards making for sidewalks and transportation. And they also recognized early that you had to begin to work with the standard setters and city government and state governments, because you had to get those who had responsibility for agreeing, for example, that standards would change and money from government would have to be used to make accessible buses, as an example. We had to go beyond. At the same time, we also really needed to understand what was our bottom line. And so I think you see this playing out in the film and in the book. As we were evolving and recognizing that, well, I think one of the important parts of camp was very much that it wasn't just a place for us to go like everybody else who went to camp, to hopefully have a good time and be away from your parents and swim and do arts and crafts or whatever it is the camp was doing. But because we were staying together, it was a real opportunity that wasn't designed as an opportunity. So, you know, I talk about, you've got specialty camps, right? Jewish camps, for example. I'm Jewish. And so kids would go to Jewish camps, not if you had a disability like me, because then, and still too often now, the camps aren't accessible. But my brothers went to Jewish camps, and they went there to have the same kind of fun as I did, but they were also learning about the religion, about the culture, things like that. The camps for disabled kids were never set up to help us discuss disability and discrimination and disability and leadership and developing a plan of action. That was never a part of this at all. But what in fact did happen by our being able to be together, not just for a few hours a day, but we also started to talk about, so what were we seeing with other peers, you know, non-disabled peers? They were beginning to talk about college. They were beginning to talk about, you know, relationships. They were talking about employment. And that was something that we really needed to talk more about, because for those of us, particularly with more significant disabilities, what we were looking to is, on the one hand, being told, study hard, work hard, the American dream. And then we were seeing this is complete lack of honesty, because what we needed in order to be able to realize whatever the American dream was really not there for a whole host of reasons. So as we began to create our own agendas, a group in New York that I helped set up called Disabled in Action, a group that I joined in Berkeley called the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, and the Centers for Independent Living around California, including in Palo Alto, I guess the Marin Center for Independent Living. These organizations really were focusing on, and still are focusing on, empowerment and really helping people to not only gain their individual voice, but also to look at the importance of coming together. And as we were coming together as a disability community, still are, in the case of work that I was doing at that point in Berkeley, we began to do work with other groups, like the Asian American community, the Latin American community, and others around budgetary issues. And we were learning from each other and supporting each other. The farm workers strike and things of that nature, we were also getting involved with. So when the 504 demonstrations occurred and we took over the federal building, we had in our planning over a couple of month period been reaching out to all these groups and helping them learn about what was 504, what was discrimination, what were we trying to do, how could they be allies, how could they be supportive. And it really paid off that we had been working collaboratively and collegially with them before. People were really beginning to understand discrimination existed in all of our communities, and we have responsibility to learn about how to address it.
So it was a really powerful movement of changing attitudes and finding common cause from the bottom up and then the top down on the legislation and policy.
Yes, and I think, you know, in Crip Camp, but there's also another piece called The Power of 504, which you can get on YouTube, which only focuses on the demonstrations. And one of the, I think, important parts that you see in that piece is how numbers of disabled people who participated in the sit-in, who had their disabilities when they were in their late teens or 20s, really became more empowered by being together with this group of mainly disabled people over a 28-day period of time. And really began to, I think, throw off their shame or their quietness, and really, you know, recognize that they had a voice, whether it was their natural voice or some form of other communication, but that what we were saying and what we believed needed to happen was right, and we had to all take responsibility for helping these issues be addressed.
Yeah, and you did so much, and yet there's still so much left to do, right, Judy? It's just it's always fighting this uphill battle. And we have a question from one of the participants today, who just was wanting to know about basically what would be. This is from Pete Polos. He wants to know about what the single piece or the most high priority piece of legislation should be next to be able to help people with disabilities live full, inclusive lives.
I don't have an answer to that. I'm as far as one thing, because I think, you know, it also depends on the community that you're from, about what something significant is. There's a couple of issues that many groups are working on. First, I think we have to put in place what's going on with the pandemic, because I think for everyone concerned about the pandemic and the impact that it's having on everyone's life, disabled and non-disabled, the unemployment rate, the economic implications, I think that really jumps to the forefront. You know, we will be moving out of the impact of the virus over the next 6 months to a year, but the economic problems are going to be with us for a long time. The world of work and how the world of work is going to be changing. And this is not just an issue for disabled people, but clearly as a disabled person, one thing that concerns me very much is as these discussions are occurring about how we're restructuring the way we live our lives, will the voices of disabled people be prominently a part of these discussions? I think California, not the only state, but California, I think, has many organizations that have for many years, disabled-run organizations, and others for many years been infusing itself more within the political structure. But in saying that, apparently last week, the governor came out with a whole slew of policy statements around health and other issues, where the litany of groups did not include disabled people. But what was very good about, not good about what he did, but good about the reaction that the disability community with other organizations very quickly got on top of this and very quickly was reaching out to the governor. If we move away right now from, which is impossible to do, from the pandemic and what's going on today and will be going on over the next number of years, we're also looking at issues like home and community-based services. The ability to get money that people need to be able to hire workers and to be able to hire people, paying them above minimum wage. That's a very big issue. And now during the COVID-19 situation, also making sure that people who are doing personal assistance work are able, where needed, to get the PPE that they need, as well as, again, looking at this issue of pay, because too many people who are doing, well, the minimum wage is just too low. And so people look at some of the work that goes on in our communities to support those of us with disabilities. They don't value the work that's happening. So not only don't they value the work that's happening, but that frequently means they're not valuing the people who are performing that work. And that also has a very adverse effect. I think other legislation is the ability to get people out of nursing homes and out of congregate living, and having more services like home and community-based services, so that people don't need to go into these more restricted settings. We clearly, the general public now is learning more about things that we've been talking about for years. Problems with the congregate living is really coming to the forefront when we see the number of people who are dying in these congregate living situations for a whole host of reasons. But maybe part of what will come out of this is the average person in the community being willing to listen to some of the issues that we as disabled people have been discussing, not just for ourselves, but obviously people are very concerned about living in these restricted living environments. But also I think it's really important that the average non-disabled person begin to look at their futures and really be able to accept that disability is a natural and normal part of life, and you can enter it without really planning, or you can enter it with some knowledge about what you may need to be doing in order to be able to continue to live a productive life.
Viewers about their rights, about non-enforcement, about where to go for help. Do you feel like the legislation that's in place now is secure, or do you worry about courts, enforcement, advocacy, information?
Yeah, so when I was the assistant secretary at the Department of Education, I had 3 components under me. One was the special ed office, which has responsibility for implementation of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and also the Rehabilitation Services Administration, which administers the Voc Rehabilitation Act, which has responsibility to help disabled individuals secure the training that they need in education and helps them pursue employment. I worry, of course, about implementation, and you know, when I was in this position, we had responsibility for monitoring all the states. And I learned very early on that the wealthier the state, the more difficult it was to get them to be making changes. And I would think of California and Washington, D.C., and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. So Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C., small, not staffed up with big law firms. When we would go in and find violations, we could put them under a plan of action, a corrective action plan, with relatively no pushback. When we went to states like New York and California, California legaled up right away with one of the wealthiest, richest law firms in DC to come in and basically push back on what we were trying to do. And it was a little fun in some ways to be able to basically understand what they were trying to do, and to really work on pushing back as much as we could to get them to make the corrections. But even, you know, we got a letter when I was working at the department from all the Republican legislators in Pennsylvania, because we found problems in Pennsylvania that we wrote up, and we're trying to get corrective actions. And we got this letter from all the Republicans, kind of threatening, you know. And I remember getting the letter and kind of laughing about it, because it really had no impact on me, no persuasive power. But you could really see how, instead of coming, like the Commissioner of Education in New York, he was very different. He was a great guy. And we had a private conversation. We were talking about the problems. And he said, look, nothing is going to happen unless you hold us accountable. So we, in fact, did issue, you know, a corrective action plan with New York. It was not easy to get implemented, but it was easier to be able to put it forward because he was willing to acknowledge that the issues that we had identified were legitimate concerns, and that he wasn't going to get involved in, you know, trying to argue something that wasn't true. And so, you know, implementation, I think, is critically important. And we had a wonderful guy who was Secretary of the Department of Education. And I think he basically, you know, when he recommended you to be hired to the president, he trusted you, and we engaged him a lot, and we were able to work with him a lot. And I feel like we also really worked on getting the voices of parents very involved in education, and lawyers who were advocates on the side of parents and kids in a way that hadn't happened before. So compliance, enforcement, technical assistance. I think technical assistance is really important. It's not just holding people accountable, but really trying to help make sure that people can get the support that they need to learn how to do things differently, which is why I get back to, you know, the universities. If the universities are not really in the area of education, teaching all teachers how to effectively work with diverse populations, we can't expect that these students who are graduating, coming into the classroom, are going to know how to do what they need to do. And even when they do, they're frequently having to deal in systems where education of disabled kids is not necessarily seen as prominent as maybe for others. So it's if our society overall, or our communities, really understand that disabled children can learn, that when children learn, they grow up learning, and they can be contributory members of our communities in very meaningful ways, I think we still have a long way to go on that.
Yeah, definitely we do. And the work is always needing to be done. Right now, it's very poignant in that everyone is doing schooling from home, and we're seeing people sort of trying to manage their learning online. But another thing that's coming up, and this is a question from Robin Klein, one of our guests, is this idea that working from home and being able to call into class actually potentially helps a lot of people with disabilities be able to access and collaborate and participate if they choose to. And also, you know, we also want in the front door. But do you have any ideas about just what it would take to be able to make this a permanent fixture, where someone that wanted to call in or wanted to be able to take advantage of some of the things that are just commonplace right now out of necessity could carry on into future iterations of what's going on in education?
Well, I have a couple of answers for that. One is, there's definitely a view in the disability community that we don't want people to be thinking that disabled people can be relegated to their homes and computers. That where it makes sense, it should be able to happen. And certainly not just for disabled people, but in general, I think many people are noticing that you don't necessarily have to be in your office 8 hours a day to be able to work effectively. So I think that whole issue is one beyond disability. But I think you also see in the area of disability that the computer is not necessarily the way to ensure that kids are going to get what they need. Now, education itself, so dramatically moving online, I think the data will, show that these kids basically, in many cases, have not been learning over the last couple months. Unless you come from a family which is relatively wealthy, has computers, knows how to use them. Kids are not getting taught between 8:30 and 3. They're doing a lot of stuff on their own. And for some kids, that might be fine. For other kids, it's not, because they're learning and they need structure and they need people around to help them and guide them during the day. So I just want to make sure that we, as I said earlier, ensure that the issues of disabled people are prominent in the discussions that are going to happen. And I think the disparities that exist in education and health are clearly coming out now. And since disability is frequently linked to poverty, one can assume that there are going to be poorer outcomes for disabled kids who come from families and who are not able to afford to do certain things or have certain things in their home or places to study or whatever it may be. So, and I've been talking more to people about this because, I think for people who are introverts, this situation may not have the same impact as those of us who are extroverts. Trevor Noah did a piece the other day with Stephen Colbert. Did any of you see that piece? Well, he was talking about he's such an introvert, Trevor Noah. You should go see it. How happy he is about all this. He doesn't care about not going out on the street and doing all these things. And, you definitely hear people who are introverts skipping the issue of disability, who really are happy that they don't have to go out and interact with people as they do on a daily basis. So some of those issues are coming out, but we shouldn't look at the computer as being a panacea for disabled people in education or employment, especially because, well, there are many reasons, but, for example, if someone in the office is getting a sign language interpreter when they need it to be able to talk to a colleague in the room next door, if someone is getting assistance in their office because they have a physical disability, to help them with papers and computer and typing and helping them go to the bathroom and other things like that. Is that something that's going to transfer over to people's homes? Frequently not. So it's complex. It needs to be addressed as we're addressing other issues. And as I've been saying, not with the presumption that we see it as a panacea to be able to stay at home and work at home.
Judy, if I can switch subjects a bit. One of the great things that I've seen in my work at the bank in the last 10 years was the passage of the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And Article 24 is specifically about the right to education. And we're just now, some years after the passage, seeing this seep into national laws and into strategies and ministries of education and ministries of health around the world. Danielle Gambona, who's a student here from Peru, writes with a question about the transition, about sort of implementation on the ground, and what's that tension between moving from specialized schools to more diverse and inclusive schools, among many of the other issues. Could you?
It's really no different than, pick a name of a country. We can start with the United States of America. We are ahead of some countries in the work that's gone on because of our laws, but and schools, special ed schools are closing down. There still are some, there aren't as many. but special ed classes, segregated classes, those types of things still exist all too frequently. I think what's important, there are many things that are important about the CRPD, but if we look at the CRPD in the area of education, I think this, what I'm going to say, also speaks to some of the issues within the disability community itself. So for someone like myself, who had my disability since I was 18 months old, I understand the issues of education for, primary school, as an example, and how children like myself didn't get to go to school for a certain number of years because the system wasn't set up, or even if it had been set up, I would not have necessarily gone to an integrated classroom. And I think we need to be, and one of the points I wanted to make is that people who are acquiring their disabilities when they're older do not understand the educational system for children who have disabilities. So you have a smaller percentage of people who are speaking from personal experience, as well as professionals who are arguing that segregated, separate education is not equivalent for disabled children. And it is not only adverse for the disabled children, but it adversely impacts the non-disabled children. I had a parent in Boston when I visited lots of schools when I worked in the Department of Education. And I visited a school in Massachusetts that, it's a great story actually. The principal was a teacher at one point, and he started losing his vision. And he went to his seniors and said that he was losing his vision and could they please give him some help and guidance. He meant to stay in the classroom. They said, go out on disability benefits. He said, no, I'm not going out on disability benefits. Eventually became a principal, and then took over a school in Roxbury, which was a school that was failing. But he was a great principal, and he also wanted to bring in disabled kids. And so he had a good percentage of kids with disabilities and non-disabled kids, and they were basically fully included. And I had a mother say to me one day, who had no children with disabilities, that her kids had been in another school where the kids with disabilities were in special ed classes, and she would never let her children go to a school like that again, because what she saw was that her non-disabled kids were learning that if they wanted to go and spend time with the disabled kids, they could, but they were not learning about them as being equivalent. And so she really saw the value beyond just learning academically. So in a country like Peru, I think, the problems that have existed there are not going to be all that different than the problems that have existed here and still, to a degree, still exist. And so I believe it's really important that disabled people and parents can really work together, really have a vision of what it is that they want, understand the CRPD, and can be working with the government, both in being proactive to look at teacher training programs, to look at how monitoring is being done of education for all children, our disabled children being held to the same standards as non-disabled children, even if they've got more significant disabilities and wouldn't be expected to be able to achieve certain levels of education. But is there an expectation that these children, in fact, can learn, will learn, and that we need to be working to ensure that their learning is improving every year? We need, in Peru and the United States, we're also addressing the issue of disparities in education for poor and significantly minority kids. And so really being able to look at disabled kids who are from poor and minority communities, and really being able to work more cohesively to help advance the improvement of education overall, And in saying that, really looking at No Child Left Behind. I think it's sharing information, looking at effective models. You know, I don't know what it is in Peru, I don't remember anymore, but you know, in some countries, when you go to the ministries of education and you look at whether or not they have responsibility for education of disabled kids, frequently it's not in the Ministry of Education. Education will be in the Ministry of Social Welfare.
Mhm.
Well, Ministry of Social Welfare knows nothing about education. So what role are they going to play to help ensure that kids are learning reading, writing, math, history, social studies, whatever? They're not going to. And so their view is going to be completely different. And when you see something like that happening, you know that the government doesn't get it either. You know, that they don't value education for disabled kids as they value it for others. So I think the CRPD is incredibly important. Groups like the International Disability Alliance, which, you know, formed around the time of the development of the CRPD, the influence that the international disability community is having at the UN, I think is very important, and at the country level. But in saying that, the disability communities have been underfunded all across the world. The advocacy organizations, the parent advocacy organizations have basically been underfunded. And when looking at education, I think it is really important for parents of disabled kids and adults with disabilities to be able to be working collaboratively together to demand quality education. Again, not just for disabled kids, but obviously for disabled kids, but also being able to recognize the importance of education for all kids.
Yeah, no, I think half of the kids that are not enrolled in primary school around the world are children with disabilities.
And the numbers of kids who are dropping out of school are kids with disabilities.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
So Alex,
the juvenile system in the US, 60 to 80% of the kids in the juvenile system have disabilities.
so Alex Fuentes is asking what advice you have for people who want to become involved in disability-related activism.
I wish I could hear him. So I was going to ask you, what do you think? Well, I mean, I think it's pretty simple. Identify groups in your communities that you'd like to go talk with, learn about what they're doing, look at what you can be adding, you know, volunteering your time, taking the knowledge that you have and helping the group learn about things they maybe don't know about, you learning from them about things you don't know about. I think, you know, really, you know, when I went to work at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, it was the first time that I was working with more disabled people that had their disabilities above the age of 14 or 15. Because previously, because I was, you know, 25 when I went out there, my experiences had been more with people who had their disabilities in childhood. And when I went out to Berkeley is when I really began to realize a couple things. The center at that time was being run significantly by people that acquired their disabilities as they were older. And so they had no idea, as I've been saying, that the education for disabled kids was completely different than what they had. And there really wouldn't be any reason for them to understand that. You know, if there was a segregated school, maybe they knew its name. If there were some segregated classes in their school, maybe they remembered that they were there. But they didn't really, you know, when Chris and I are talking right now about kids who are out of school and kids who are dropping out, these are kids who not exclusively, but significantly are kids with invisible disabilities, learning disabilities, mild to moderate intellectual disabilities, ADHD, ADD. In many countries, they don't even know what those terms mean or have teachers or healthcare professionals who are knowledgeable about any of these different kinds of disabilities. And, you know, I have tried frequently, you know, to, when I was in a position to do that, to really ask the question, of the kids who drop out of school when places like the World Bank are engaging? What do they know about who the kids are? Do they know about whether or not they have a disability? Do they know when they were starting to drop out of school? Do they know anything about the teacher training? And if you don't know that, then you can't do anything about it. If you have a better understanding of why kids are not going to school or why kids are dropping out of school, and certainly for kids with learning disabilities or mild to moderate mental health or intellectual disabilities, they may in fact start going to school, but they stop going to school pretty early on. When I visited a number of juvenile facilities, when I, again, was still at the Department of Education, I would ask the kids, when did they stop going to school? And typically they would say 14, but the teachers, especially, they had special ed teachers in some of the prisons or juvenile facilities, they were telling me, no, the kids were dropping out at 10 because they stopped going to school every day. So they consider kids who are not intentionally going to school 5 days a week as kids who are dropping out. And by the age of 14, they'd stopped going to school. And what you saw in the States was kids that were not behaving well in class. The teachers were not necessarily upset about the kids not coming to school because it made their teaching easier if they didn't have kids who needed, additional support. So I think it's an issue which still, I think in part, you don't really have a strong group of advocates who themselves have learning disabilities. It's not that there aren't organizations, there certainly are, but it doesn't jump out at you. Parent groups for sure, but adults with certain disabilities, they're not yet organized enough. And in order to really look at an issue like education, which I think desperately needs to be looked at, because the kinds of interventions that many of these children need are things that could be addressed if we understood it better and teachers who were being trained better and we were really pedagogically able to provide supports earlier on.
And that would benefit all kids, as you say. I'm sorry, Ben. Yeah.
So Judy, there's I think a common sentiment that the majority should get the funding and that we shouldn't be spending money towards smaller groups that sort of are special interest or considered that way. And I'm curious if you have like an argument or just a way you frame it to show that there is economic reasons and valuable actual profit that can come out of serving all the groups instead of just kind of the tyranny of the majority.
I mean, I feel in some way, because some of our laws are really civil rights laws like Section 504, the issue of money is one that shouldn't really be discussed. In other words, when looking at education, which is what we're talking a lot about now, I think we need to be recognizing that we have a responsibility to educate all children. And, some children may have higher costs because of needs that they have. But overall, I think we can, show that people with quality educations are able to move into the world of work and contribute. And what we need to allow people to understand is disabled people are no different than others. If they're not getting a quality education, their contributions are not going to be able to be the same. I think, one of the other issues that's really important is what is the world of work going to look like in 10 years? And what skills are people going to need? And are disabled children and young adults and adults getting the kinds of training that they need to be able to work in the future world of work? I mean, education is, I would hope, something that's going to be around forever, but numbers of types of jobs that people have had, they're going to be changing, as we can see they have been changing. over the last number of decades. So I think that's really another issue that we need to be paying more attention to. But yeah, I mean, for some kids with disabilities, special ed costs or costs for those individuals is higher than for others. But I think like when you look at the world of work and you look at studies like the first one that came out in 1970, the Sears Roebuck study on accommodations, which still, you know, is pretty appropriate today. You know, you see that for the average disabled person, many of those people don't need any accommodations, and that the typical cost of an accommodation is like $100 to $500, so it's inconsequential. It's the smaller group of people who need who need more supports, but relative to the overall economy, I think that's very important. You know, when you look at laws like Section 504, which makes it illegal to discriminate against someone with a disability if the entity is getting money from the federal government. If you want to try to prove that something is unduly costly, that harm will be caused, you have to look at the entire budget. And in looking at the entire budget, then you need to say, oh, is this really harmful? Is this going to adversely affect a university, for example? And typically the answer is no. If it's a smaller business, the answer may be yes. But in most cases there, it's also not. So I think really you're right in raising this issue, because we know for many people, it's kind of a subliminal thought that's there. You know, if you look at some of the, well, someone was telling me the other day that the Chamber of Commerce was trying to get a provision in one of the CARES bills that would have said, basically, you don't have to comply with ADA or 504 for construction, for renovations, for reasonable accommodations. And the fact that the Chamber of Commerce, they lost. It didn't happen because the disability community got to a number of members of Congress and it didn't happen. But the fact that they thought about this was not based on anything rational. It was based on the fact that you've got, my God, what's the name of that actor? Clint Eastwood. Clint Eastwood, who has been trying to get the law amended, the law which says when you're building something new or making a major renovation, you have to make it accessible. I think one of the hotels that he was involved with didn't do what it was supposed to do, so they were sued. And he wanted to get them another 6 months to be able to make the changes that needed to be made. And they were trying to get this into legislation. Well, that's completely ridiculous. You know, if they're hiring architects and if the city that they're in doesn't know what the rules are, that shouldn't fall on the laps of disabled people to have to deal with their non-compliance. So I think it's the community as a whole has to see the value in these laws, not just for a group, what they consider a small group, but something that impacts them today or could impact them tomorrow and other people in their community.
It just seems to me that any country that is going to discourage or waste 50% of their population because they're female, or 20% because they belong to an ethnic minority group, or 15% because they have a disability, go on and on, 5% because they're LGBT, is going to lose in this world. This is an intensely competitive world. So exclusion costs. It's not a benefit.
Right.
Exclusion has a real cost to it.
See, spoken by, if not an economist, one who lived with economists for 25 years.
Now, Judy, there's, you know, ADA did a huge amount for making access closer to a norm. And yet there's still so many situations where ADA maybe is being adhered to, in that there's a door opener for the front door to the building, but not necessarily one to the restroom or to the entryway right inside the front door to the building. And to me, that's a problem of having legislation in place, but not having people understand the sentiment and the meaning behind the legislation.
So actually, I don't know what the California law is, but basically the ADA and the standards are a floor. And the federal law does not require electric door openers. What the federal law requires is that a door not be heavier than 5 pounds in pressure. Now, California, for example, the federal law says Title I, the employment provisions cover companies of 25 or more. California changed their rules to say 5 or more. So in California, if a company has 5 people or more, they're covered under Title I. Hold on a minute. What I think is interesting about what you're saying is it's not just disabled people who miss that electric door, because people are getting used to carrying things and needing to push something and how easy it is to push the electric door opener, and are asking more and more, why isn't it here? And yes, maybe they use us as an excuse of, oh, wow, it's difficult for you. But at the end, I really think people see it as something which makes common sense, which I think is really one of the important things about the work going on in disability. That, you know, making buses accessible, having elevators at trains, having teachers who can accommodate to working with kids who have different learning backgrounds, having employers who recognize diversity is an asset to their company, and how they have to address people who are working and our customers who have different religious backgrounds and different sexual orientations and race and blah, blah, blah. And the role of women and why we need daycare and things of that nature. They benefit the society overall. And I think we need more of a discussion to look at what have been the benefits of laws like the ADA and IDEA and others that most people don't even think about. I love to be at an elevator by our metro system, which I haven't been on since February, where you'll see all these people with baby carriages, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6 baby carriages going to get onto the elevator. Now, most of those people have no idea that the elevators wouldn't be there if it weren't for the activities that disabled people, fought for, because people now expect it. People have no idea that there used not to be ramps to be able to get up and down a sidewalk in and out of a building. When you go into a bathroom, a public bathroom, and you've got a family room, which is a big room, which really started out as rooms for wheelchair users, and then go into the public bathroom, and you have to have a certain number of accessible stalls per 6 stalls, I think. I go into the bathrooms, and it is invariably what's going to happen. There can be empty stalls. The wheelchair accessible stall is not empty. And why is that? Because people want to be in a bigger space. Nobody is arguing that you shouldn't make a bigger bathroom because it costs a little more money, which it doesn't, to make this bathroom accessible. Or maybe we could have an additional stall if we didn't have this room, which was bigger. No, people gravitate there. I was late for a plane once, and there was a woman changing her dog in the only wheelchair accessible stall. Sometimes people come out, they don't look at you. Sometimes they'll come out and say, I'm sorry. But at the end of the day, I just look and say, I know that there were these empty stalls before. You didn't need to use this. Or they're all accessible, and then we all can use bigger bathrooms, which is ultimately what people want.
Yeah, and I think that people are well-intentioned, but they don't necessarily know. And so to me, it's like we all can recognize the value and validity, and the cost is not that much, but it seems
Cost
like
is nothing, but I really need to say something.
Yeah.
On the issue of physical accessibility, the cost is nothing. When you do it from the beginning, there is no appreciable cost differentiation. It's when you have to go back in and make the changes. That's where the costs come in.
Elizabeth Kozlowski says, one of the things that Crip Camp reminds us of is the power of community recognition and affiliation. And then she asks, what are the features of deeply inclusive school communities? that erase margins and center us all together in the pursuit of belonging for each and every student.
I mean, I think an inclusive school is one where the children feel respected across the board, and where teachers take responsibility for all the children, valuing all of them, and where the school itself goes beyond just the school, but what goes on in the community. And so you're really developing a community of people who understand the importance of supporting each other, value, respect, address issues of bullying, racism, other isms, ableism, and where the principal purpose of going to school is to learn, and that learning is about the traditional academics, but learning is also learning about how to be humane people who respect each other and know how to ask questions and know how to grow in being able to really create communities of harmony.
Thank you so much, Judy. This has been such a great chance to speak with you. We're just about out of time. So I just wanted to let everybody thank you, and any closing thoughts you'd like to leave us with.
So I think what's important is, you know, whatever it is that you're doing, there were 150 at one point, I think, that were registered. So like, why did you want to come? Did you learn anything that triggered your thinking about something that you want to do more of, that you want to share with other people, that you want to do in your classroom, in a Stanford classroom, or in medical school training, or whatever it is? I think ultimately any of these kinds of lectures are really intended to help people think about what other people are saying and the value of what you're hearing or not, and to try to implement some of it in the way you live your lives. And I think, you know, disability, most people would not argue, has gotten its due day at the university level in academic teaching, or in community life, or in what's going to go on after students graduate into the world of work. So I just think there's an immense role, and universities like Stanford, because of your prestigious nature, really being able to take disability on as a meaningful part from the president on down, speaking about it as a part of diversity. I think that's really important, and making sure that, you know, there are lots of people out there who have a lot of information to give on disability from multiple perspectives. And if it becomes something which is more commonplace at places like Stanford, it's also Stanford as a leader in really being able to set the direction of where higher education needs to go in expanding its ability to effectively educate all people.